February 25th, 1945, St. Augusta Auxiliary Hospital, Intramuros, Manila. The air, thick with the metallic scent of old blood and gangrene, finally settled as the shelling ceased. For the first time in days, the silence was louder than the explosions. Anya pressed the small, feverish body of a Filipino boy closer, her own tunic a flimsy shield against the dust still raining from the ceiling. A new sound emerged, the crunch of heavy boots on rubble, steady and deliberate. An American captain appeared in the shattered doorway, his uniform impossibly clean against the backdrop of filth and despair. He held his rifle low, a gesture of peace Anya had seen practiced by his men all morning. A handwritten sign posted by a lieutenant hours earlier hung crookedly on the wall. "Wounded will be cared for. No harm." The captain's eyes scanned the rows of makeshift beds, the overflowing buckets, the utter destitution. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Anya rose slowly, every muscle screaming in protest. "We need disinfectant," she said, her voice a raw whisper. The captain nodded, turning to speak to his radio man. She took a ragged breath and screamed, the sound tearing from a place of bottomless exhaustion and fury. "No! Now we need disinfectant now." He turned back, his gaze unwavering. "It's okay, ma'am," he said, his voice calm amidst the ruin. "Help is here. We tell the stories of humanity found in the war's most forgotten corners. Subscribe and share in the comments which country's untold perspectives you would like to see next." 6 weeks earlier, the St. Augusta Auxiliary Hospital, Intramuros. The humid air of late 1944 clung to everything in the St. Augusta Auxiliary Hospital, a heavy, wet blanket that promised no relief. For Anya Schmidt, the day began and ended with the same ritual, a small act of defiance against the decay that threatened to consume them all. Steam rose from a large white enamel basin set over a sputtering kerosene burner, carrying the faint, sharp scent of carbolic acid, watered down again to make the dwindling supply last. With a pair of sterilized tongs, she carefully lifted strips of laundered linen from the boiling water. They were no longer bandages, not really. They were ghosts of bandages, frayed at the edges and grayed from countless uses. But they were all she had. Her movements were precise, economical. Each strip was laid out on a clean, sun-bleached cloth to dry. This was her sacred corner of the ward, a small space where order still reigned. But beyond it, chaos lapped at the edges. The low, constant murmur of pain from the patients, a mix of local Filipinos caught in skirmishes and a few Japanese soldiers with jungle fever, was the hospital's true soundtrack. Every cough, every fevered whimper was a reminder of how thin the line was between her careful hygiene and a fatal infection. Later that morning, hope arrived in the form of a runner from the port. "The Red Cross shipment," he panted, his eyes wide with excitement. "It's here." A wave of relief, so potent it made Anya feel lightheaded, washed over her. For weeks they had been waiting, praying for this delivery. It meant real dressings, perhaps even sulfur powder or quinine. It meant lives saved. She followed the runner to the entrance just as 2 Japanese soldiers were carrying the first of several wooden crates inside. But they did not bring them to her supply room. Instead, they stacked them near the door, where Lieutenant Watanabe, the officer overseeing the hospital's administration, stood waiting. He was a small, stern man whose posture was as starched as his collar. He bowed curtly to Anya. "Nurse Schmidt," he began, his German formal and precise. "The Imperial Army appreciates the work of the Red Cross. These supplies are vital for the war effort." He gestured to the crates. "They will be redirected to the military garrison." Anya felt the blood drain from her face. "Lieutenant," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "My patience." "We have nothing. The convention also recognizes the realities of war." he cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. He pointed to a small cardboard box at his feet. "You will have this for the hospital's needs." "It is generous." The soldiers shouldered the large crates and marched out. Anya was left staring at the small box. It probably contained less than a tenth of the original shipment. She felt a familiar cold knot of powerlessness tighten in her stomach. Without a word, she picked up the box and carried it back to her supply room. Inside, she found a few dozen rolls of proper gauze and 2 small bottles of iodine. A treasure and an insult. She carefully hid half of the gauze and 1 bottle of iodine under a loose floorboard. Then she returned to the ward, her face an impassive mask, and looked at the white enamel basin, still steaming with its useless clean water. The fragile order had been broken. It began as a rumor in the blood, a vibration felt through the soles of the feet before it was ever a sound. But within days, the rumor became a deep, resonant thumping that rattled the window panes of St. Augusta. The American guns had found the edges of Manila. With the sound came a new tension, a brittle fear that settled over the wards like dust. The Japanese soldiers grew quiet, their gazes constantly drifting southward. While the Filipino patients whispered prayers Anya could not understand, but whose meaning she felt in her bones. A new casualty arrived near dusk. A young private, no older than 18, carried in on a makeshift stretcher. His leg was mangled from a skirmish in the city's outskirts, the wound packed crudely with field dressings that were already soaked through. Anya set to work immediately, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She called for the white enamel basin, filling it with boiled water that had long since gone cold. As she began to clean the wound, the murky water quickly turned a sickening pink. Lieutenant Watanabe appeared at her elbow, his presence as sharp and unwelcome as the distant artillery. "He requires surgery to prevent the loss of the limb," Anya stated without looking up. "I will need anesthetic." "He is a soldier of the Emperor," Watanabe said, his voice flat. "He will be prioritized." He gestured toward her hidden supply. Anya knew he was referring to the single ampule of Novocaine she had managed to acquire weeks ago, a treasure she guarded for the most desperate cases. Just as she was about to protest, 2 orderlies rushed in, carrying the limp form of a little girl. Her dress was charred, her arm covered in angry, weeping burns. She was not crying. She was locked in a silent, trembling state of shock, her eyes wide with unseeing horror. Her mother followed, wailing, pleading in Tagalog. Anya understood enough. A cooking fire, a nearby explosion, a terrible accident. Anya looked from the soldier, now groaning in semi-consciousness, to the little girl, whose life hung by the thread of shock and impending infection. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a command from a place deeper than military orders. She turned to Watanabe. "The girl's burns must be cleaned now or she will die. The pain will kill her." "The soldier," Watanabe began. "He is stable," Anja interrupted, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. She walked to the locked cabinet, retrieved the precious ampule, and broke its seal. She administered the entire dose to the child, whose small body finally relaxed as the anesthetic took hold. She worked for an hour, cleaning the girl's wounds with what little iodine she had left. When she finished, she found Watanabe waiting for her, his face a cold, unreadable mask. He stood beside the white enamel basin, its water now a dark, clouded red. "You chose a civilian over a soldier of the Empire," he stated. "It was not a question." "I chose the patient in greater need," Anja replied, meeting his gaze. He let the silence stretch, the only sound the rhythmic thud of the faraway guns. "Your neutrality protects you, Nurse Schmidt," he said softly, his voice laced with menace. "But do not forget that our protection is a privilege. It is not a right." The distant drumming of the guns did not fade. Instead, it grew into a deafening, continuous roar that seemed to come from the very bedrock of the earth. The sky over Manila bled orange and red, a permanent, violent sunset that offered no peace. Inside St. Augusta, every explosion sent a tremor through the walls, shaking dust from the crucifixes and rattling the medical instruments in their trays. Anya moved through the wards, her voice a low, calming murmur, offering sips of water and adjusting pillows, trying to project a confidence she did not feel. The world had shrunk to the space of these crumbling walls. The shell that hit them came without warning. There was no whistle, no shriek of approach, only a blinding white flash, followed by a sound so immense it felt like the world tearing in half. The floor heaved beneath Anya's feet, throwing her against a wall. A tidal wave of pressure and pulverized plaster slammed into her, stealing the air from her lungs. Then darkness, a profound, suffocating blackness, filled with the sudden, sharp screams of the wounded and the terrified. For a moment, she lay stunned, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. The air was thick with the acrid smell of cordite and the chalky taste of cement dust. Pushing herself up, she felt a wet stickiness on her forehead, but there was no time for her own injuries. The section of the hospital housing her small, orderly supply room and sterile corner had simply vanished, replaced by a gaping hole that looked out onto the fiery night sky. Her white enamel basin lay crushed and twisted under a fallen ceiling beam. Everything she had fought to preserve, the clean linens, the hidden iodine, the semblance of medical decency, was gone, buried under tons of rubble. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. This place was no longer a hospital. It was a tomb. "The basement!" a voice shouted through the gloom. It was one of the Filipino orderlies. "We have to get them to the basement!" The words galvanized her. Anya stumbled through the debris-strewn hallway, her world lit only by the hellish glow from outside. She grabbed patients who could walk, half carrying, half dragging them toward the heavy cellar door. Others, too weak to move, had to be lifted onto blankets and slid down the stone steps, their groans of pain echoing in the narrow stairwell. The descent was a nightmare of chaos and desperation. Each trip back into the ruined ward was a gamble against another direct hit. They worked in near total darkness, guided by touch and the sound of terrified breathing. Finally, the last conscious patient was moved. Anya stood at the top of the stairs, taking one last look at the devastation. The hospital was a skeleton, its bones picked clean by the fire and steel of war. She pulled the heavy wooden door shut, plunging them into a damp, musty darkness. The roar of the battle was muffled now, but the silence that replaced it was heavier, filled with the scent of earth, mildew, and despair. The basement smelled of damp earth, sweat, and the sweet, sickly odor of infection that Anya had come to dread more than the shelling. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of darkness and dim, flickering lamplight. She had established a new kind of order in the gloom, one born of sheer desperation. Her ritual was no longer about sterilization, but about triage. Who could be saved? Who had a fever that could be cooled with a damp rag? Who was already lost to the gangrene that crept, black and relentless, through the wounds she could no longer properly clean? She found a substitute for disinfectant in a forgotten crate of rice wine, a crude, burning alcohol that made the patient scream but was better than nothing. The screams were the worst part. Without anesthetic, every procedure was an act of controlled brutality. She learned to shut off a part of her mind, to focus only on the task at hand, the sawing of bone, the tying of a suture, the tight packing of a wound with boiled rags that were never truly clean. A chipped enamel bowl, salvaged from the rubble, became the new heart of their subterranean world. Placed beneath a leaking pipe, it collected a slow, steady drip of precious, relatively clean water. Each drop was a victory, measured out in spoonfuls for the parched, and used to rinse the few surgical tools she still possessed. The bowl was their clock and their wellspring, a focal point of hope in the suffocating darkness. One afternoon, she was tending to the young Japanese private whose leg she had been forced to amputate. The stump was inflamed, the infection threatening to spread further. She had used the last of her makeshift bandages. Without a clean dressing, he would not survive the night. She looked down at her own filthy, torn tunic, then at the simple cotton slip she wore beneath it. It was her last personal garment, the final layer between her and the filth of this war. With a resolve that felt like a kind of surrender, she turned away, found a pair of scissors, and cut a long, clean strip from the hem. She lost track of who she was in those moments. She was not Anja Schmidt, a nurse from Germany. She was a pair of hands, a determined will, a force moving against death. As she carefully wrapped the soft cotton around the soldier's leg, she felt a profound sense of detachment, as if she were watching herself from a great distance. Later, as she sat slumped against the damp stone wall, utterly spent, a shadow fell over her. It was the young Japanese soldier, the one she had treated weeks earlier with the last of the Novocaine before the world had ended. He was pale and weak, but he was walking. He said nothing. He simply knelt before her and placed a small, hard biscuit, his own ration, into her hand. He bowed his head slightly and retreated back into the shadows. Anya looked at the small, dry piece of bread. In the oppressive dark of the cellar, it shone with a light all its own. It ended not with a bang, but with a slow, ragged fade into nothingness. For 3 days, the Japanese resistance had dwindled, the frantic staccato of their machine guns becoming sporadic, then isolated until finally there was only a single, defiant rifle shot that echoed through the ruins before being swallowed by an immense and terrifying silence. The silence was a physical presence in the cellar. It pressed in on them, heavier than the tons of rubble overhead. After weeks of the world being a relentless wall of noise, the quiet was disorienting, painful. Anya could hear the frantic beating of her own heart, the shallow, rasping breaths of the dozen survivors huddled in the darkness around her. A single cough from the far corner sounded as loud as a gunshot. The ever-present dripping from the pipe seemed to toll like a funereal bell. For hours, no one moved. They were suspended in a state of dreadful anticipation. The battle was over, but the war was not. What came next? Anya's mind, conditioned by years of German newsreels and whispered rumors, painted grim pictures of the Americans, brash, violent conquerors who would see no difference between a German nurse, a Japanese soldier, and the rubble they stood upon. They would clear the cellars with grenades, not questions. Fear was a cold, slick thing in her gut. It would be so easy to stay here, to huddle in the dark and wait for whatever fate decided. But as she looked at the pale, upturned faces around her, she saw the flicker of hope in their eyes turning to a dull resignation. She saw the young Japanese private whose life she had saved, now watching the cellar door as if expecting death to walk through it. She thought of her oath, her duty not just to heal, but to protect. Waiting was a choice to let them all die, either from starvation or from a conqueror's casual violence. A different feeling began to push through the fear, a stubborn, defiant resolve. She had not survived the shelling, the filth, and the despair, only to surrender to silence. She had to act. She would not wait for the enemy to define them. She would present them with a truth they could not ignore, that this was a place of healing, a place of sanctuary, however wretched it had become. Slowly, deliberately, she rose to her feet. The movement drew every eye in the room. She walked to the small pile of discarded dressings, her mind searching. She needed a symbol, a flag, not of surrender but of truce. Her fingers found a piece of linen she had set aside, a strip cut from the cleanest part of her old slip, the one she had used on the young soldier's leg. It was clean, or the closest thing to clean that still existed in their world. It was white. She held the small, fragile piece of cloth in her hand. It felt as heavy as a shield. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm her racing heart, she turned toward the stairs that led up into the unknown light. Pushing the heavy cellar door open was a monumental effort. It scraped against the stone floor, the sound grating in the profound silence. Light, sharp and brilliant, sliced into the darkness, forcing Anya to raise a hand to shield her eyes. She took the stairs one at a time, her legs trembling. The small white scrap of cloth was clenched tightly in her fist. When she emerged from the stairwell, she had to stop, her mind struggling to process the scene before her. The world had been remade into a landscape of skeletons. Ruined buildings clawed at a sky that was, for the first time in weeks, a placid, indifferent blue. The air, scrubbed clean by a recent rain, smelled of wet ash and something else, the deep, sweet, cloying scent of death that had been the backdrop to their lives, now laid bare under the open sun. Then she heard it. The crunch of heavy boots on rubble, steady and deliberate. A patrol of American soldiers was moving down the street. They were large men, larger than she remembered men being. Their uniforms were a dusty olive green but seemed impossibly clean. They moved with an unnerving confidence, their weapons held low but ready. One of them, a lieutenant, stopped to nail a hastily written sign to a standing doorframe. "Wounded will be cared for. No harm." The gesture seemed absurd, a small island of order in an ocean of destruction. An officer broke away from the group and approached the hospital entrance, a captain judging by the bars on his collar. He saw her then, a lone, filthy figure standing in the wreckage. He stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes, a startlingly clear blue, taking in her torn tunic, the dried blood on her forehead, the utter exhaustion etched into her face. He held his rifle pointed at the ground, a conscious signal of non-aggression. Anya took a ragged breath, the clean air searing her lungs. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, rasping whisper, lost almost as soon as it left her lips. "We need disinfectant." The captain nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He turned slightly as if to speak to his radio man. The simple movement, the slight delay, broke something inside Anya. It was the calm, measured pace of a world that had time, a world she no longer belonged to. For weeks, every second had been a choice between life and death. Delay was a luxury they could not afford. A raw, primal sound tore from her throat, fueled by weeks of buried terror and impotent rage.
"No!" she screamed, the force of it staggering her. "Now we need disinfectant now!"
The captain turned back instantly, his gaze sharp and focused, but not hostile. He saw not an enemy, not a threat, but the precise shape of her desperation. He took a half-step closer, his voice steady and calm amidst the ruin. "It's okay, Mum," he said, the words cutting through her panic. "Help is here." The captain's calm words hung in the air, a lifeline thrown into the wreckage of Anya's composure. He did not ask for explanations. He did not demand an accounting of who was in her care. He simply said, "Show me." Numbly, she turned and led him back to the cellar steps. Each step downward was a descent back into her world of shadow and stench. The sudden transition from the bright, open air to the close, fetid darkness seemed more pronounced now, more shameful. She was acutely aware of the captain's clean uniform, his solid presence as he followed her into the gloom, using a flashlight to cut a clean, white path through the darkness. He swept the beam of light across the makeshift ward. It illuminated the faces of the sick and dying, Filipino civilians, Japanese soldiers, a German nurse, all rendered equal by their suffering. He saw the filth, the overflowing buckets, the rags that served as dressings. He saw the chipped enamel bowl, still patiently collecting its slow, precious drops of water. His face remained impassive, but Anya saw a muscle tighten in his jaw. "We have nothing left," she said, her voice hollow. No antiseptic, no clean bandages. The gangrene. She trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the rows of wounded. She expected him to dispatch a medic with a field kit, perhaps a few pouches of sulfur. That alone would have been a miracle. The captain did not call for a medic. He turned to her, his gaze direct. "Come with me, Mum." He led her back up the stairs, back into the shocking sunlight. He walked past his patrol to a large canvas-covered truck parked a short distance away. With a single, fluid motion, he unfastened the ties and threw back the heavy flap. Anya stared, her mind refusing to comprehend what her eyes were seeing. It was not a truck full of soldiers or ammunition. It was a mobile pharmacy, a cathedral of healing. Wooden crates were stacked to the ceiling, their sides stenciled with the iconic Red Cross and words that felt like scripture. Penicillin, sulfur powder, plasma, morphine. There were metal footlockers filled with gleaming surgical instruments and cardboard boxes overflowing with things she had only dreamed of: syringes, sutures, and rolls upon rolls of pristine, white gauze bandages. It was not a day's supply or a week's. It was enough for a year. It was an arsenal of life. The sight broke the dam of her control. A sound, half sob, half laugh escaped her lips. The world, which had been a tight, grey knot of survival, suddenly unfurled in a dizzying wave of colour and possibility. The weight of the past weeks, the impossible choices, the constant presence of death, it all came crashing down on her. Tears streamed down her face, hot and unstoppable, the first she had allowed herself to cry since the siege began. She did not bother to wipe them away. Through the blur, she saw the captain reach into one of the boxes. He pulled out a single roll of white gauze bandage and gently, respectfully, placed it into her hands. It was solid, clean, and real. It was a promise. The cellar was transformed. The suffocating darkness had been banished by the steady white hiss of several gas lanterns, casting sharp shadows that danced on the stone walls. The smell of death was gone, overpowered by the clean, chemical scent of antiseptic. American medics, young men with weary but efficient movements, had established a coherent system of triage. It was organized chaos, and to Anya, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She worked alongside them, a silent figure in borrowed fatigues that were several sizes too large. There was a barrier, and it was not just language. The medics were polite, calling her Ma'am with a detached professionalism, but she could feel their watchfulness, especially when she tended to the Japanese soldiers who were now officially prisoners of war. One medic in particular, a corporal named Miller with tired eyes and a perpetual frown, kept his distance. The moment of truth arrived with a patient the Americans had brought in from another pocket of resistance, a Japanese sergeant with a piece of shrapnel buried deep in his abdomen, dangerously close to an artery. The American surgeon was overwhelmed at another makeshift station, leaving Miller and Anya to handle it. "He's losing blood fast," Miller said, his voice tight as he applied pressure. "We need to get that metal out." Anya nodded, already laying out the sterilized instruments the captain had given her. They rested in a clean, white enamel basin salvaged from the rubble and scrubbed until it shone. The light of the lantern glinted off the polished steel, a sight that calmed her nerves. She began the procedure, her hands steady and sure. Miller assisted, handing her instruments, his movements tense. She worked quickly, locating the jagged piece of metal, but it was lodged against the arterial wall. Any slight slip would sever it. "Forceps," she said. Miller slapped them into her palm. She probed gently, but the angle was wrong. She needed to clamp the artery on both sides of the shrapnel, but she couldn't do it alone while also keeping the incision open. "I need you to hold the retractors wider and apply pressure here, no here," she instructed, her English clipped and precise, tapping a finger on the exact spot. For a heartbeat, Miller hesitated. He looked from her focused, determined face to the pale face of his enemy on the table. Then something shifted. The medic in him took over. He saw not a uniform, but a patient. Not an order from a German nurse, but a necessary medical command. His hands moved to where she had indicated, his touch firm and confident. They worked in silence after that, a seamless, unspoken rhythm of two professionals united by a single purpose. When the final suture was tied, Miller finally let out a long, slow breath. He looked at Anya, and the suspicion in his eyes was gone, replaced by a weary, grudging respect. He gave a short, sharp nod. It was not praise, but it was more than enough. It was an acknowledgement. In that moment, she was not the enemy. She was simply a nurse. Later, as she was cleaning the instruments, Captain Davis approached her, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Coffee," he said simply, handing one to her. The warmth seeped into her cold hands, the rich, bitter aroma, a scent from a life she thought she had lost forever. A fragile sense of normalcy had begun to take root in the ruins of St. Augusta. The Americans had established a small command post near the cellar entrance, and the steady, rhythmic clatter of a typewriter became the new background noise, a sound of order and administration replacing the chaotic symphony of war. In a quiet moment between shifts, Anya found a discarded copy of the Stars and Stripes newspaper on a crate left behind by a soldier. Eager for any news of the outside world, she smoothed out its creases and began to read. Most of it was news from the European front, stories of advances and victories that felt a world away. But then she found the editorial section. Her eyes scanned an opinion piece titled, "Whose Penicillin Is It?" The author, likely a soldier writing from the field, raised a pointed question. He wrote of American boys dying of infection in the Pacific jungles, of limited supplies of the new miracle drug, and of the moral ambiguity of using those same precious doses to save the lives of the very men who had been trying to kill them just days before. The prose was not hateful or jingoistic. It was pragmatic, weary, and filled with a logic that Anya could not deny. It spoke of a duty to one's own first and foremost. A cold knot formed in her stomach. The flood of mercy she had experienced, the unquestioning humanity of Captain Davis and his men, was not a simple, universally held truth. It was a choice, and apparently a controversial one. She thought of the young Japanese private whose life she and Corporal Miller had saved. According to this article, that act was not a clear-cut victory for medicine, but a debatable allocation of resources. The coffee in her mug suddenly tasted bitter. She was so absorbed in the article that she didn't hear Captain Davis approach until he was standing beside her. He glanced at the headline she was reading. "Tough questions?" he said quietly, his voice devoid of judgment. Anya folded the paper carefully, as if hiding evidence. "He makes a logical point." "Yes, he does," the captain agreed, surprising her. He looked out over the makeshift hospital, at the American medics tending to both Filipino civilians and Japanese POWs.
Logic doesn't always have the last word.
"Not in this work?" He paused, searching for the right words. "We aren't fighting to be the same as them. We are fighting to be better. We don't do what's right because it's easy, ma'am. We do it because it's right." He gave her a small, tired smile and walked away, leaving her with his words. She looked down at the newspaper in her hands, its cold logic now seeming flimsy and thin compared to the captain's simple, profound conviction. For the first time in years, she felt the urge to write a letter home to her parents in Germany. She would not write about the bombings or the starvation or the terror. She would write about the typewriter, the taste of real coffee, and the quiet captain who believed that mercy was not a resource to be allocated, but a principle to be lived. The news came on a clear, bright morning, carried by a Red Cross official who looked impossibly pristine amidst the lingering devastation of Intramuros. An exchange had been arranged. Anya, along with other neutral medical personnel, was to be repatriated. She was going home. The words should have brought a surge of joy, but instead they landed with a quiet, complex weight. Home was a place she could barely picture anymore, a lifetime away from the person she had become in the dust and darkness of Manila. She spent her final day walking through the now thriving field hospital. Tents had been erected, wards organized, and the steady hum of generators provided constant light. It was a world away from the cellar. Her work here was done. A group of Filipino nuns, their white habits a stark contrast to the olive drab of the military, had arrived to take over the care of the civilian patients. Before she left,
Anya sought out one last piece of her old life.
she found the white enamel basin, the first one, the one she thought had been destroyed. A soldier had pulled it from the rubble, dented and scarred but intact. She spent nearly an hour scrubbing it, removing the last traces of grime and dried blood from its crevices until it shone with a dull, weary luster. It was no longer just a bowl. It was a witness. It had held the boiling water of her futile hopes, caught the bloody residue of her desperate surgeries, and now it was clean again. She found the head nun, a small, elderly woman with eyes that held a deep,
Unshakable peace. Anya offered her the basin.
"For your work," Anya said, her voice thick with emotion. The nun took it, her hands covering Anya's for a moment. She said nothing, but her eyes conveyed a complete and perfect understanding. In that silent exchange, a legacy was passed. The simple object, once a symbol of Anya's fragile order, was now a vessel of renewed hope. Captain Davis was waiting for her by the jeep that would take her to the port. The sounds of rebuilding, the distant clang of hammers on steel, the shouts of men clearing debris were beginning to fill the city, a tentative pulse of life returning. "Thank you, Captain," Anya said, meeting his gaze, "for everything." "You did the hard work, ma'am," he replied, his customary professionalism softened by a genuine warmth. "It's not just the medicine," she clarified, needing him to understand. "You showed me that there could be a different way." After, he seemed to understand her meaning perfectly. He simply nodded, a gesture of shared experience that transcended their different uniforms and languages. As the jeep pulled away, Anya did not look back at the ruins of the hospital. Instead, she looked forward, toward the harbor where a ship waited to take her across the vast blue ocean. The future was a blank page, and Germany was an unknown. But for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid. The silence on the horizon was no longer a threat. It was a promise of dawn.